We'll be focusing on, we'll say, resumes plus, because in order to talk about resumes, we must necessarily also talk about the resume's two good friends, the application and the cover letter. So while the bulk of today's workshop will be focused on best practices and techniques to build your most effective resume, it will be bookended by a brief discussion of applications at the beginning and a brief discussion of cover letters at the end. We're going to be covering a lot of ground today, so we are going to get right to it. And by the way, today's content is all going to be an overview. And so as we go through it, if you find yourself inspired or confused or intrigued or motivated, then I'd really encourage you to continue the conversation by setting up an appointment at your nearest career force office. And then we can get into some more individual work there. So, as promised, let's talk applications. This will be a very brief check-in about applications because if anyone attended last week, there was a little bit of a deeper dive there. And anyone who is in an active job search knows that every application has got its own quirks. But I have heard from many job seekers over time wondering, why on earth do I have to prepare a resume with my contact information and my work history and my education and my skills, and then attach it to an application where I then must type up my contact information and my work history and my education and my skills? Are they being mean? Is this a mind game? What's going on? The reason that you are asked to submit both of those things is because one of those documents, the application, is a legal document created by the employer. The other is a marketing tool created by you for you. They have generally got different jobs, even though they have a lot of the same information. So we'll cover just a couple of tips here. So as far as applications go, no matter what type of application you're filling out, you want to read through the instructions and as much of the application as possible to see what you're getting into, what you need to make sure to have on hand as far as the information that you'll need to fill out. That's not always possible because some applications need you to finish the whole page before you can go to the next one, but it's good to take a look and see how much you can see. Also, give yourself plenty of time. Some applications are quick and some are so-so, and some will ask for your last 10 years of employment and unemployment experience. And if you leave out even 1 month not accounted for, you will not be able to go to the next page. If you don't know ahead of time, then make sure you're setting aside plenty of time so you don't have to stress about it if it's taking longer than you expect. You also want to make sure you're setting aside time to target your resume to the position and to draft a cover letter. And fear not, we are going to be touching on both of those things before we are done with this hour. Another good tip is to make sure to fill out everything. If something on the application doesn't apply to you, still put in NA or not applicable, but try not to leave anything blank. That way the employer knows that you saw the question and it's not applicable to you rather than that you missed it or forgot it or skipped it or what have you. Another good tip, read the small print. Often this will be toward the end of an application and there will be a great big block of text and it looks very legally and it simply screams, I am very boring, please skip me and just sign and it'll be fine. Don't listen. I would recommend reading through that block of text because that can have some important information about how your application will be used, about what they're going to be doing with that information, who are they going to follow up with, what will be the expectation of you, and just ultimately what you're signing. And even if you are typing in your name, if it's an online application, there will be something in there that notes that that counts as your signature. So take it as seriously as you would if you were filling it out with ink and signing in ink. You want to make sure that you know exactly what you're agreeing to. And finally, last big tip for applications, and this is one that I recommend to everybody because it saves so very many headaches. Keep good records. If you haven't tried this, I strongly encourage you to. If you're in an active job search, then you might be submitting several applications per day, several days per week, and that can pile up very quickly, especially when every application, or nearly everyone, will potentially ask you to create a username and password. And anyone who's made more than 2 or 3 passwords knows that everybody has different criteria for what that password needs to be. So in order to keep your information in order so that you know kind of who you're still waiting on, what information you needed to submit, what do you need to do if you need to sign back in to check the status, then keep good records. Either write it down or put it in a spreadsheet, but I recommend keeping track of the date that you applied, what company it was, what position you applied for, and the job number if there is one, the username and password that you used for that application, And then any additional information that you might want to keep track of. If you had to make security questions in case you forget your password, write down the question and the answer exactly as you typed it in. Some of them are case sensitive, and it is a headache and a half to try and get back into an account if you don't remember exactly how you typed that password. I can't tell you how many times I've seen someone said, well, it's St. Paul. I go, so ST or ST period or SAINT, or are they all capital or just the S is capital? It's, as I said, a headache and a half. So keep track of that information and it will make your entire application experience go much more smoothly. Ultimately, you just want to remember that the application is sometimes the very first thing that an employer knows about you and nothing else. So you want to make sure that you are making as good an impression as possible. Any questions about applications that you're seeing, Sheila, before we jump right into resumes?
Yeah, there are a few coming in here.
Oh, okay. We are
So,
awake. Great.
yes. So, one is asking, so for those online applications, is it better to go older to newer, or is there a way to move things upwards on those tools?
That depends on the application because different companies will use different software for their applications. And so some of them will allow you to reorder your work history if you need to. As a rule of thumb, I'd recommend starting with the most recent and working backward from there. If you do find that you have accidentally put things in a different order than you want, like I said, sometimes you'll be able to just reorder them or move up or something like that. Sometimes not, and then it's just a little bit more work. But so, general rule of thumb, most recent to least recent is what I'd recommend.
Okay. Thanks, Vanessa. That's the only question at this time.
All right. Great. Well, then let's jump right into resumes. And like I said, we're going to be covering a lot of ground today. It's going to be a quick, now 50 minutes. And so we are going to be discussing many different things. So the hope is that when you click out of this workshop at the end, you will understand some of the key resume basics and the basic resume sections. You'll understand the importance of targeting and some ways to go about doing that. You understand some of the different resume formats available and formatting choices available to you and the importance of using the right one for you and what an accomplishment statement is and how it's used to sell your skills on a resume and an idea of kind of how to construct one. And finally, we'll talk briefly about the importance of sending a cover letter and the basic content to include. So to start with, to answer this question on the screen, is there a perfect resume? The answer is both absolutely not and yes. And here's why. It's absolutely not because there is no exact formula to resume writing. It is very individual. It's your marketing tool. And so what works very well for Sheila may be a terrible choice for me, and vice versa. But yes, because by picking out an appropriate format that tells your story well and that represents you in your best light for a given position, then that may be the perfect resume for you. And so there can be a perfect resume for you. There's just not a formula that works for everybody. So keep that in mind as we move forward. The most important thing is that you are comfortable with your resume and feel confident about it as a representation of your professional self. And so you want to be able to use it to sell your background and your skills when you're interviewing. So as you are reading about resume advice, I saw some of the advice that you entered with my little icebreaker this morning, by the way. Thank you. We have some pros here already. That was all very good advice. But the more you read and research about it, the more you're bound to find conflicting advice. Is it 1 pages or is it 2 pages or is it 5 pages or are all of these terrible? And when this happens, the first question you want to ask yourself is about the context. Is this advice directed to a job seeker with a specific industry, with a certain background, with this much experience or less experience? Is that me? And then you want to ask, is this advice what's right for me? Does this tell my story well? Because ultimately, you can put your resume through as many little testers as you want to see if it will pass an applicant tracking system. You can have as many people look at it as you want, but the ultimate test, really the only test for your resume is it generating interviews for positions that you want? If it's generating interviews for you, but they're all for positions that are outside what you're interested in or that you're over or underqualified for, it's not doing its job. If it's not getting you interviews at all, it is definitely not doing its job. It's doing its job when it's generating interviews for positions that you want. So, with that understanding, we want to talk through what are some of the things you do want your resume to do? What does it look like for your resume to be effective at doing that? Well, to start with, you want it to be a solid review of your qualifications. And note the wording there. If I were to walk up to you in the street and say, hey, could you tell me your qualifications? A very reasonable next question for you to ask would be, my qualifications for what? Ultimately, your resume is an answer to a question. And there are some misconceptions about what that question is because it used to be a different one. So, not very long ago, the expectation was that your resume answers the question, what is your professional background? And that's that. And so you would write about all of your professional background, and that's your resume, and you're set. Things have shifted in the job market. And nowadays, the question that a lot of employers really want your resume to answer is how well does your professional background match this position that I am hiring for? And so when you start constructing your resume and flip that switch and think in terms of answering that question, suddenly your resume will become more targeted because you are thinking in terms of how well does this match, not just what is everything I've ever done. So you want it to review your qualifications for the position that you are applying for, or at the very least, an occupation or industry that you are applying for or getting connected with. The way that you do that and review those specific qualifications is to include essential information only, only items that help market you to the employer. Ideally, you would like to have it so that no matter where an employer looks on your resume, they see a case for why they should hire you for this position. They see a way that you match the position. And you want it to also show information about you, but make it skills based. You want it to be about your accomplishments using the skills that made you good at your job, and to make that a good example of why you will be good at this job. And so you want it to not just be a list of things that were assigned to you in the past, because that doesn't say much about you. You want it to be a list of what makes you unique. Not just this was assigned to me, but this is what I did, and this is how well I did it, and this was the result. That is the very basic form of an accomplishment statement, which we'll be coming back to a little bit later. Ultimately, you are using your resume as a marketing tool. You are marketing a product. And so it's about you. You are going to be drawing attention to your best skills and qualifications that match the job posting. And the way that you make it effective is that, like I said, it gets you the interview. And to make sure that that communication comes across very well, make sure it has a nice appearance, that it's targeted, that it's quick and easy to read. You want to just make it as user-friendly as possible for whoever is going to be looking at that resume. And finally, and you may notice I'm circling back to this quite a lot, you want to keep it specific. How are you the best fit for this position? So keep some of those things in mind as you're moving forward and working on your resume. Some other basics to think about as you're getting your resume ready. Like we said, it's not a complete history. It is a preview of coming attractions. It is your movie trailer, just enough to get the employer interested and wanting to know more. And what makes it a quick and easy read are things like clear sections, that you use bullet points. Our brains often just like lists better than they like paragraphs, so it's easier for us to read them. So you're not writing an essay, marketing document. And the other thing to keep in mind is that it's a living document. It's a fluid document. It's not something that you just make one and done and this is what you're sending to everybody. If it's not getting you interviews, if it's not working, you can change it. You can change it whenever you want. So with that in mind, speaking of kind of how these can look, then we come to a slide that I really like. So let me explain what you're looking at here. This image comes from a study that was done by the ladders.com. It shows the results of a very fancy piece of software that they use that shows the heat from a recruiter's eyeballs as they moved over these two resumes. So where you see it as yellow and red, that's where they spent more time looking. If it's blue, then it's less time. And then if it's white, they really did not even look at it long enough to register. So these are two different resumes. But very briefly in the chat, what do you notice first about the resume on the left? Both about the colors that you're seeing from where the recruiter was looking and just what you can see of the format behind it. So just a couple words. What do you notice about it? It was largely ignored. Ignored the long paragraphs. Disinterest. Yes, more paragraphs. Yes. Too copy heavy. very wordy, too much detail, a paragraph format. Yes, you guys have all got it. Thank you. And you're right. Yes, what we see is that there is a lot of text, especially right about here. And what else do we notice about what's right about here? There's barely any color. The recruiter was over it by then. They did not continue reading. And we spend a lot of time on our resumes. We put a lot of work into them. And so we want to make sure that it's constructed in such a way that if we put that work in, that recruiter is going to look at the whole thing, right? So yes, and also things to note on the left side, there are some very wide margins too. And what that does visually is it makes it kind of look like a column of text, which makes it look even more dense and makes it even harder for our brains to focus on. So that is rough for the owner of that resume. But where did the employer look? Just right about here, and then a little bit over here, and I think maybe got distracted over here. But there was a lot of focus on the very top third of that resume. So then, again, briefly, what do you notice about the resume on the right? Again, both the colors that you see and what you can see of the format behind it. Review the entire document. Bullet points, yes. Manage the space well. Yes, you notice there is some white space. It feels balanced. Interest in education. Yeah, this recruiter was very interested in the education. And look at where it is, all the way at the bottom. But it is clearly marked so the person can see it. Too narrow of margins. Thank you, Luann. Yes, this kind of goes in the opposite direction. It's not a perfect resume. Those margins are barely even there. And the reason that that can be rough is that if you are putting this through an applicant tracking system, and I saw there was a question about that, we'll be coming back to questions soon, is that when you're putting this through an online application, sometimes the software that's processing that resume can only read to certain margins. And so if they're too wide, then some things might get cut off, and that can cause problems as you're going through that process. Trying to fit everything on one page. Yeah, potentially there could be ways to format this in a way that utilizes the space a little better to be able to use more than one page. Yes, thank you, everybody. Yes, so overall, more balanced over here, a little bit more readable, a bit easier for our eyes and brain to process. And as a result, there was a look all the way from top to bottom. But also something to note, neither of these resumes shows just a wall of red. That means nobody was closely reading word for word every word of these resumes. We scan, recruiters scan. That is what they do. And so you need to make sure that it is scannable. And I mean that twofold because you want it to be scannable by a person. You also want it to be scannable by a computer. So very briefly, an applicant tracking system is software that many employers use that will scan your resume and or your application before any human looks at it, and sometimes can do some screening right there. And so if there's not enough of a match between your resume or application and the position you're applying for, it might just get tossed out before any person looks at it. So it is important to take that into consideration because that is some employers' process. So the nice thing is that many of the things that make something scannable for a computer also make it easier for a human to scan a document. So, for example, fancy fonts. Try to avoid them because, for one thing, that can be misread by scanning software that's used by many organizations. And it can be a little harder for a person to read too if you got a bunch of curly cues going on or if it just doesn't read very easily. Using bold and capital letters to highlight information can be helpful, and that can be a little more effective than using italics, underlines, borders, lines across the page. All of these things. Sometimes that format can be erased going through applicant tracking software. Sometimes they can only read text. And so you want to make sure that you're doing a format that still works. And there you can have more than one version of your resume too. You can have one that goes through the online application, and then you can have one that you hand to people, and that can be formatted a little differently. But ultimately, you want to make sure that it is easy to read, easy to scan by both a person and by a computer system. And you can do some research on applicant tracking software too. Usually when you're going on through an online application and you click apply or thereabouts, then it will take you, you won't stay on the employer website. It will take you to the website of that applicant tracking software. A couple names that come to mind are ICIMS is one. You may notice that's up in the web address uh, area when you are going to an online application. Another one I think is Workday. And so you can take a look at that, Google that, and then you can see what you can find for tips on submitting a resume through that system. There's also a helpful website called jobscan.co, which I think Sheila can put in the chat and or in the follow-up email. And that has some great information about applicant tracking software as well. As far as templates go, you will see many resume templates that may use various formats listed as those to avoid. There are some that will specifically say these are all ATS friendly, and that just means that they can be read well by applicant tracking software. Not all of them are, even though they can look very nice. But so just be mindful as you're looking through them, because goodness knows there are thousands of resume templates out there. And they are different levels of friendly with both with the human eye and with the computer eye. But ultimately, you just want to make sure the formats don't distract from the message of relatable skills and your work history. You don't want anything to distract from your content because that is the most important part. And speaking of content, let's talk about it. You want to make sure that all of your content is honest. Inaccurate information can cost you your job later. And so you don't want to fudge things. We are going to talk about ways to kind of move the spotlight around on your experience, but that all needs to be true experience. And so you're going to be focusing on skills and things you've achieved or accomplished, not just the tasks that you performed. Employers like results. That tells a stronger story about who you are as an employee and the type of work that you do, what you bring to the table. You want to keep the resume focused on that particular skill or particular position. If you try to include all of it, it makes it harder for the employer to envision you in the position. Remember what question you are answering. How well does your professional background match this position? And so targeting your resume to a particular position can help the employer see how qualified you are for it. It can increase the likelihood that you'll be called for an interview. Then that doesn't mean that you don't potentially have a wealth of skills in all different areas, but it does mean that you might not be able to effectively put your forklift skills on a resume for a chef position unless chefs in that role are expected to go into the back room and use a forklift to get all the ingredients. So you want to keep it focused. And so you want to make sure, finally, that you are speaking the language of that job description. If I am applying for a trainer position and I talk about all my facilitating experience, they might not register that that's the same type of work. But if I'm speaking the language of that, I say, yes, I have a lot of training experience. Then they can see very easily, apples to apples, here's how I match this position. And then finally, very last thing on this slide, if you are getting feedback after submitting your resume that you are overqualified, if that feedback is coming to you before you even have the interview, then you might want to look back at the resume and see what you can do about targeting it even further. Because what that can mean is that your resume is answering a different question than is being asked and providing more information or different information than is needed. So if you're getting that feedback, set up an appointment with one of us at Career Force and we can talk through what can help it to be more impactful for the type of work that you want to do. And now we'll cover, yes, Sheila.
Yeah, I just before you go on to the next topic here, there's a couple questions about applicant tracking system.
Okay.
So I think you answered this because they want to know if there's a system to test ATS format. And you gave the job scan resource. But someone else is asking, is there a list of other services that scan resume? Are you aware of any other resources that scan?
I don't have one off the top of my head right now, but it's very possible that such a list exists. And so, yeah, I see I'll Google that. Yes. That would be a good call. It is very possible, but there are so many out there that there might not be kind of a finite list. And so there are large companies and smaller ones. So it just depends. And not every employer uses applicant tracking software either. It's just pretty common right now.
Right. And then just one other question that might be a good lead into the resume format here is someone wants to know, is it better to start with a blank page or to use a template like Microsoft Word resume template or something like that?
It depends on the template. Like we said, some templates are ATS friendly and some of them are not so friendly with that. And so you'd want to be mindful of the template you're using. It also depends on kind of your confidence level working with the word processing document you're using to craft that resume. So if you feel very confident in your work in your skills for formatting that and make so that you know that what you have in your head, you'll be able to execute that and make it a resume that you feel good about, great, start from blank. That works fine. If you are not feeling so confident about that and you would like to have a starting point, there are some nice basic templates out there. We have some sample resumes on the job search guide on the Deed website too. I don't remember if sample resumes are going out in the email after this, but there are plenty that are available to you as well, so you can get some inspiration from there. So the answer is it's complicated. But yes, Microsoft Word has basic resume formats. Google Docs has basic resume formats that, at least according to Indeed.com, are ATS friendly. So there are options for you there.
Okay. There's a couple more questions, Vanessa, but I think you're going to cover them when you go through the next few slides. So we'll wait and see.
Okay, okay,
Thanks.
sounds good. Well, yes. Well, now we are going to be talking about formats. I'm going to talk briefly about some general good tips for formats, and then we'll look at a few specific types of formats that are commonly used and talk through when is it appropriate to use this type of format? What would this one tell your story the best? So, to start with, in general, no matter what type you use a resume format that best presents your skills relative to the job description that you're targeting. You'll find when you're looking at different formats, what you're doing is shining the spotlight on different parts of your experience and your skill set. And so whatever will present you in the strongest light, that's the format that you want to use. Many of you noticed on our page with the eyeball measuring that there is a lot of focus that goes onto the top 1/3 of that page, the top part of that resume. It is a key section. If an employer does not look at any other part of your resume, they're probably going to look at that. And so that is where you will want to make sure that you put your intention, which is a professional title, an objective, a profile, a summary statement, something that is giving a snapshot of what they are going to be reading about and why they should keep reading. That's also where you can put a skills section, where you can list skills that you have that match the position that you're applying for. So, top 1/3, that is golden zone. You want to make sure you're grabbing the employer's attention there. Also, some things that some of you noticed on the resume on the right from that previous slide. Having some white space can make a big difference. Having white space on your resume, it feels like a breathing spot when you're reading through all this text. So you want to make sure you can utilize white space by using bullet points instead of paragraphs. And we talked about margins. Ideally, you want them to be 1/2 to 1 inch and not more or less than that. Because when they're wider than that, it starts looking like a column of text. And when they are narrower than that, it sometimes can get cut off by applicant tracking software. Font size, you don't want to go below 10. Frankly, I personally wouldn't recommend going below 12 or if you can help it, maybe 11. But when you get below that, then it can get very difficult to read for folks. Sometimes they'll be looking at it electronically and can zoom in, but often they'll have it in front of them and you don't want their memory of your resume to be the headache that they got from looking at it. So keep that font size pretty easily readable. Also, once upon a time, not very long ago, it was very common to include references available upon request at the bottom of a resume. The job market is very fickle and it has changed. The trend has changed. So it's no longer trendy, so to speak, in resume fashion to have that at the bottom of the resume. It is implied that you'll provide references if you are asked. And so if they if they are not asked for right away, don't worry about it. You will be asked eventually, very likely. And then if they are requested, for example, if the job description says to apply, submit your resume, cover letter, and references to this email address, then you will be able to provide them. I would recommend putting them on a separate sheet of paper and use the same name and contact information block that you use on your cover letter and resume. Anybody who attended last week might remember some talk about branding your documents. And for anyone who is not familiar with that, The idea is just making sure that your documents look like they all belong to the same person. Same name and contact information block, same font, same margins, that sort of thing. So that you basically you want all your documents to look like they're going to the same party. So if you are creating a reference sheet, make sure that it matches your other documents. So we will now move into talking about 3 specific resume formats and what they do with that spotlight. So ultimately, keeping in mind while we're talking through these 3, think about what you think about your story. You think about what format will tell your story the best. And no matter what format you use, focus it, target it, focus it, target it. You're answering the question, how well do you match the position? So to begin with, we will start with a format that many of you may be familiar with because it's very traditional. It's been used very commonly. This is a chronological resume. And it is chronological because it starts with your most recent work experience and then the one before that and then the one before that. And so by having that format, it highlights your recent employment, puts less focus on positions that you held a long time ago. It's great for people who have a pretty consistent work history. It can be great if the type of work that you've been doing is similar to the work that you're applying for. Take our friend Robert here, for example. In his summary, he introduces himself as a production assembler. His skills and experience are generally very specific to production assembly. His last job title was production assembler. His previous position was circuit board assembler, which is a form of production assembly. And in education, he focuses on soldering, which is a form of production assembly. Every section of this resume is singing a song about production assembly, and we can probably guess that that's the type of work he's applying for. And so the story this resume tells is how well this next position fits with the trajectory that he has been on. And so if that is similar to your experience where you are applying for a position in a similar field that you've been in for a long time and there's a clear kind of step that you're taking, then that can be a really great option for you. For a chronological resume, you want to make sure that you are going back 10 to 15 years and probably not more, at least in detail, or your last 3 jobs. And if you are concerned that you have previous experience that's more than 10 to 15 years old and you want to honor that on your resume, there is a way we can do that, and I will talk about that in a few slides here. So that was a chronological resume. That is probably not the best option for somebody who is new to the workforce or changing careers or has several different types of work in their background. So let's talk about something that's great for people new to the workforce here. This is a functional resume. It's sometimes called a skills-based resume. And so what you can see here is that similarly to chronological, we've got the contact information block, we've got the objective or a form of a summary here, qualification highlights. Summaries can look like many things. But instead of jumping into your most recent position, it instead goes into accomplishments. And the beauty of this format is that it's very adaptable. You can really customize it. And so you can look at that job description, and no matter what format you use, make that job description your best friend. So look at the job description, determine, okay, they are mentioning customer service 1,000 times here. It's really important to them that I have customer service expertise. Your first skill set could be customer service. And so then you can talk about the phone customer service that you did at your most recent position and the in-person customer service that you've done in a previous position, the business-to-business customer service that you provided 5 years ago in your other position. So you can pull all that together. It's not necessarily tied to a given employer or to a given date, but rather you are putting that information in to say, I have these skills. For somebody new to the workforce, this can be skills that you built at school. It can be skills you built in extracurricular activities, in community activities, in volunteering, all different areas where we build skills in our lives. And so you can customize that to the position. And then down below, rather than saying, here's the work that I've done, it's just showing, here's the education, the training, the personal development that I'm bringing to the table as well. So if someone's at the beginning of their career journey, this could be a great option to really highlight all the strengths that you would be bringing to a new position. But Vanessa, you might be thinking, that's not my situation. I have work experience, but I'm looking to change careers, or it doesn't quite match what I want to do next. What is there for me? The answer is a happy marriage between the 2 types we just looked at, the combination resume. So this has some great aspects of both formats here. you'll see that we've got that summary statement at the top again with the contact information block. And then we have, similar to the functional resume, selected skills and experience, some specific categories of skill, followed by employment history, just as a list, and education. And check out what this format does with that spotlight. In the summary statement, Susan here introduces herself as an experienced security professional. So we're probably applying for a security related position. The selected skills and experience are building and personnel security, emergency management, leadership, customer service, all very strong for security. And these bullet points I won't go through very much, but goodness, they build a strong case for her to work in a security profession very successfully. So that is the first 2/3 of the resume. And by the time I get down to employment history, I am excited about this person for a security position. Then we get to employment history, and it's listed with the dates: infantryman, valet, bartender. What is not there? Security officer, security guard. She has not worked in that specific role before, but because she's shown the spotlight on what was most related to that position and the expertise that she's bringing to the table that's related, then she's already made a case for herself. And so then that can make it a little easier to go, okay, well, she hasn't done this before, but look at all these skills. Imagine if instead she had used a chronological resume. Then the first thing the employer would see is job titles. And the first thing they would see is that she does not have experience in this type of work. And so that can change the story that you're telling. This one tells her story as, I am qualified for this position. Here's where I got these skills. So those are all things to think about as you move forward. So that was a lot of ground. Let's pause here. Sheila, any questions in the chat before we move on?
Yes, we have lots of questions in the chat, Vanessa.
Hey,
um,
I'm ready for you. Let's go.
Yeah, first of all, I'm not sure if I heard you say this or not, but how far back do you go with your employment history?
Ideally, 10 to 15 years, even 10 to 12 years. That can vary depending on your industry. For example, some industries, there's a lot of change pretty regularly. And so even going back not as far would work better. But the rule of thumb is 10 to 12, 10 to 15 years for at least going into detail.
Okay, and then should the title on top under your name be the job title or your own generic title?
Let's see. Maybe are you referring to maybe one of these? Um, So that depends on your personal preference with how you're formatting your resume. This one, for example, will say job title from the employer's posting, say this is what I'm applying for. Some will have sort of a headline for their summary, and that will be how they are defining themselves for this position. So if, for example, if Susan were to have one of those, and she doesn't, but if this resume had a headline, she might put security professional or something like that. And so then it'd be, this is how I'm introducing myself to you professionally. So it's ultimately comes down to personal preference and just how you're utilizing that for your resume.
Okay. And then is it advisable to have your picture on your resume?
Generally, I mean, again, this might vary by its industry, but as a rule of thumb, I recommend not providing any information to an employer that they cannot legally ask you about. And so I would recommend probably not including a photo, just because they'll be meeting you at the interview regardless, but that way you're not providing additional information for them for any implicit bias that might be there. It's not legal, but it happens. So that's what I would recommend. Just to stay on the safe side, I would not include a photo.
Okay, and we have a couple questions about references.
Okay.
So someone's stating that they feel frustrated when employers ask for references with their initial application.
Mm.
They don't want to wear out their references, from calls and emails. I'd much rather send references if I get an interview or a job offer. Is there any way I can respectfully convey that to an employer?
It's challenging because different employers are going to have different processes for that. And some of them, that is just their process. They ask for that information right away and on the application. And so part of that might be to get multiple references, to get more than the kind of the standard 3 if you can. And just so that way you can potentially put the most appropriate references for a given position, and that way it's not always the same people. But I frankly, if that is their process, then that's likely what they're going to need because sometimes they will take that information and then if they want to interview you, they'll also send an email and say, hey, send this to your references or something like that. And so it can unfortunately just be part of the process sometimes. I don't know, Sheila, have you seen anything else that's similar to that or anything different?
No, I think that that's pretty accurate. And if they ask for them during the application process, you more or less should provide them because that's what they're asking for at that time. And a lot of applications, paper applications or online will have a reference section on them. You know,
Yep. Yeah, so really the key is just have those references and their information ready. If you can get more than 3, that'd be great. I know that's not always possible, but if it is, then that's what I'd recommend.
And then another question about references. What information should you provide about the reference? This person says they usually give name, phone number, and email address. Is there anything else they should be including?
Something that can be helpful to include is how you know that person. So, previous colleague at this company, for example, or previous supervisor, and then the company name. Sometimes that's something that they'll want to know. Another thing that sometimes they'll ask for would be how long have you known this person? That's I think optional to put in yours, but you can if you've known the person for a long time, then that will strengthen their reference for you. That's what I've seen most commonly, and especially when they ask on the application, that's usually the type of information they ask for.
Yeah. And also I've seen people include the reference's job title.
Yes, yes, that too.
Sometimes that is helpful as well. Do you want to take more questions right now, Vanessa, or do you want to move on?
Let's keep rolling here because we are already down to about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure we're covering this in a quality fashion. So we've talked about some specific formats, and now we're going to think about what were the basic parts. And this is rhetorical, but think back when you were looking at those 3 formats, were there certain sections that appeared on every single format in one way or another? And so, very likely, yes, there were. That's the easy answer. Yes, there were. So, to start with, we're just going to talk about those kind of core 4 sections. So, to start with, nice and easy here, the contact information block. Here are some good tips for this. When you're putting in your contact information block, English is difficult sometimes, then make sure you use your full name rather than any nicknames. And you may notice that on this example, you don't see a street address, just the city and state. These days, many agree that removing the street address is a good idea just because it can potentially be a security concern. It could potentially allow you to be geographically profiled. Granted, will the application ask for your full address? Very likely, yes. But this is your marketing tool, so you can put on it what you feel would be helpful to you. Also, as a best practice, note that there is one phone number and only one phone number on this. Sometimes folks want to make it easier for the employer to contact them by thinking, well, yeah, I want to put my cell phone number and my home phone number just in case they don't reach me at the cell phone number. That can just kind of complicate things for the employer, though. So I'd recommend including your primary phone number and just letting that be it. You don't need to label it as your cell phone number or home phone number just because of the format, they'll be able to tell what it is. Also, and this is a rhetorical question, but I encourage you to think about it. When is the last time you listened to your voicemail message recording? If your answer, if you're thinking about that, is a long time ago or a general, ugh, then I encourage you to go in and listen to it. Make sure that it's up to date. Make sure that it's professional. Make sure that it is representing you well. I can't tell you how many things I have heard over the years. I've listened to an entire song over the course of that 2 minutes of a voicemail recording. I have been jostled around in someone's bag for 2 minutes, wondering if this is the voicemail recording or if they accidentally answered or what's going on. There have been people having some fun with their friends, which can be lovely, but also is not always super professional. So take a listen, make sure that it's representing you the way you would like to be represented to employers. Same goes for the email address. You want to keep it professional. Some version of your name is best. And a good tip is try to avoid numbers that appear to be the year of your birth, even if it's not the year of your birth. It could be the year that your kid was born. It could be the year you graduated. It could be all different types of things. But The employer doesn't know that. And so, again, try not to provide any information they cannot legally ask you about. So, try to avoid that so that no one's automatically jumping to conclusions about your age. Again, that is information they cannot legally ask about. So, try not to provide it. And finally, if your LinkedIn profile, for one, if you have one, and if it is active and up to date, then I'd recommend including that profile link as well. That gives the employer the chance to learn something more about you and to see that you are up on this technology and that you have more to show. So those are some good tips for the contact information block. Below that, on each version of the resume, then there was some version of an intention, either an objective or a summary or a profile or something similar. And so this is great to have at the top because it's a quick way to give the most important information to the employer right at the top of the page. So you want it to be very specific to the position you're applying for. And you want it, when I say specific, I want to make sure that you are putting in meaningful language, not necessarily just sort of a wordy statement that's kind of generic. It's very common for someone to recommend saying, seeking a challenging position with a growing company. And perhaps you are, but that says very little about the type of work that you want to do or what you're bringing to the table. It's just saying, this is what I want, and doesn't say anything about your intention. Like, are you applying for this position on purpose? So try to avoid just the me oriented phrases in general, and you don't want it to only focus on I want. Keep in mind, even if you do have an I want, think also of I bring. So seeking a part-time position in the floral industry, offering expertise in merchandise trimming and preparation, etc. Or creative and motivated engineer with more than 10 years of experience. This person is saying, I'm looking for an engineering related position and I have experience, and here are some of the good qualities that I'm bringing to the table. That can be more powerful and more impactful than looking for a rewarding part-time job in the engineering industry with room for growth and advancement. That's a perfectly natural and good thing to want, but it doesn't say anything about what you're bringing to the table. So always make sure you're thinking of a give and take. Now, basic resume parts, the next part will be professional experience, and we're going to break that down between how that looks on a chronological resume and a skills-based or combination resume. On a chronological resume, then this is where you're going to want to list your most recent employment first and determine how far back you need to go. This shows that you've got the job title, the dates, the company, the city, and then your accomplishment statements below on your bullet points. And we'll talk about accomplishment statements shortly. But you can also include volunteer experience sometimes if it is related. You just want to make sure that you're indicating it properly because you don't want to mislead and like let them think that you worked at this place if you were volunteering. On a skills-based or combination resume, then you will want to determine what types of qualifications you're going to highlight from the job description. And then again, you'll be putting your accomplishment statements below, and that it doesn't need to be all from one employer or all from one experience. That is just where you're pulling together what have you done or accomplished under the umbrella of, for in this case, engineering. And so that is how you'd want to make sure and construct that section. And then finally, last core section here is education. So here's some things to know about an education section. We haven't talked about it much. If you have any post-secondary education, if you have any college, even if you went for half a semester, you don't need to list your high school. That can be assumed by the fact that you have some post-secondary education. So that is just fine. The dates are optional for education, for any level of education on the resume. Because as some of you I think I've mentioned in the chat, education dates can suggest your age and how current your academic knowledge is, even if many of the things that you studied are still relevant. But take that into account. And so if it's more than 5 years old, maybe, then consider leaving that off the resume. And plus, you can bet this information will be required in an application. So if they need the information, they're going to be able to get it. But if this is your marketing tool, you have more control over this document than you would about the application. You want to do this similarly to the work history section, listing your most recent education first and then going backward from there. And if the position you're applying for is not related to the subject you studied, you can leave off the subject. You can just state that you got this degree or post-sec or associate's degree coursework or whatever it is that is relevant to you. And so that way you, oops, pardon me, that way you are not kind of pulling their focus in a different direction than how you fit the position. And finally, you have the option to list training or continuing education as well if it's relevant to the position you're seeking. So those are the core sections, and there are others that you can include. You can get creative with this as long as, big asterisk, as long as it's relevant to the position you're applying for. And that is the case for every one of these on this list. But you can include this, and there's one that's not on here that I want to highlight. If you are in a situation where you have more than 10 to 15 years of experience that you want to make sure and highlight, there is a delightful type of section that I like to call additional relevant experience. And under that section, you can put a few sentences summary of the collective experience that you have prior to where you've put more detail. So that can be a really helpful way to share some of that information and to highlight some of the additional expertise you have. If you have questions about how to construct that, then contact your local career force. We'll be able to help you out. Finally, in these other sections, be cautious of including any affiliations that could be polarizing. If you worked or volunteered on a political campaign, if you volunteered with a religious organization, it's not bad to do any of those things. These can be very enriching activities. And if you are applying for a position with a company or an organization that's clearly aligned with that, then that can be very powerful to include on the resume. But if you don't know, just be aware that you have no idea who's going to be looking at your resume. And so you want to make sure that you are not potentially alienating anybody. And so that is something to keep in mind as well as you're constructing and deciding what you want to include. All right, we are down to the last 5 minutes, so we are going to quickly talk through accomplishment statements and cover letters, and then you will be free for the day. And as I said, this is a very quick hour, as you may have noticed, and so anything that is still kind of lingering when you're done, call up your closest career force office, and then someone can sit down with you in person or virtually to really talk through how this works for you. So I've talked about accomplishment statements a lot. And an accomplishment statement is what you would put on those bullet points under your work history. So as you can see, this little equation, it's got to have an action word. And if you look up action words on any search engine, you will be showered with examples and lists of many, many, many appropriate action words that you can use on a resume. And because you will be showered with lists, I encourage you to try and avoid repeating any of those verbs as you are creating your resume. You can try alphabetizing it if you want to make sure that you're not having any repetition. But keep that in mind. If you have a lot of the same word, if you have managed 4 times in a row as the first word in your bullet point, that can be perceived as a sign of disorganization or a lack of attention to detail. So action word is important. Details are very important, and the outcome, a result of the work that you did. So phrases that I would recommend avoiding would be phrases like responsibilities included or responsible for. And the reason that I am not friends with those phrases is that they don't add much value or information about what you brought to a role. I invite you to think of if you've ever encountered somebody for whom something definitely was in the job description and they were not carrying it out successfully. If you're just saying I was responsible for this, you're not saying anything about whether you carried out that task successfully. So my recommendation is banish the terms responsibilities included, responsible for from the resume. So we do not have time to do a lot at this point because we had some fantastic questions and I am so glad that you guys are so engaged. But what I will discuss is that some things to keep in mind as you are going. These are some examples of task statements. They don't say very much. And so you want to add some information, not just adding words, but adding information. So what could turn a task statement into an accomplishment statement is detail. Kept inventory turns into more information. Kept inventory says one thing. This is what I did. The accomplishment statement says what I did, managed daily inventory, how often, Of over 1,000 classifications, how many? Of medical supplies. Of what? That is four pieces of information about what you did rather than one in about 10 words. Same deal with calling customers. If you called customers, you're saying maybe two things. You used a phone and you interacted with customers. In the accomplishment statement example, grew client base results from 0 to 70. This is by how much? Within 2 months, this is how quickly I did it. By effectively using cold call techniques, this is how I did it. Both of these accomplishment statements have 15 words or fewer, but they give a lot more information than their predecessors do here. So those are a couple of examples of accomplishment statements, and any one of us at the Career Force offices would be happy to talk with you through more about how to frame the experience that you have and the accomplishments that you have done. All right, we are down to the last 2 minutes. I know that there are more questions in the chat and appreciate them, but I want to make sure we get to the end here. So last bookend here, we talked about the applications at the beginning, and that was the first bookend. This one is about the cover letter, the more controversial friend of the resume. And I say more controversial because there are some who may say a cover letter is just a formality or it's obsolete, but there are some who do not believe that and who would be more likely to hire somebody if they submit a cover letter. So since you don't know which party the person you're going to be sending your resume to belongs to, then I would recommend including a cover letter, if allowed, with your resume whenever possible. So for that, you want to make sure that it's branded, same name and contact information block as your resume. They're going to the same party. And then you address the letter to a specific person whenever possible. If you can't find somebody's name, you can say, "Dear hiring manager," or "to the blank hiring team." And make sure it's targeted just like the resume, but make sure that you're giving new information, not just a paragraph version of what's on your resume. So this is your opportunity to write in full sentences and say, here's why I'm interested. Here's how I match your needs. Here's an anecdote that shows my passion or how well I've done in this type of work. So that's your opportunity to share more. And you don't want it to be super long. They can be pretty short, to the point. 3 paragraphs, probably no more, and ideally no more than 3 to 5 sentences each. You will have the option to indicate how you will follow up. And if you do, make sure you keep that appointment. Let the first thing they find out about you be that you do what you say you're going to do. And finally, usually you won't be asked to include your salary requirements in a cover letter, but sometimes you will. If you are asked to do that, do it as a range, not just a number, if possible. And let that come from your research of the local competitive wages. There's a great website for that called ONET Online, and that will be in the follow-up email. And proofread, edit, edit. That is what I'd recommend for both cover letters and for resumes. And because in an active job search, sometimes you've looked at your resume and cover letter for so long that it stops looking like words, please feel free to set up an appointment with one of us. We can look over your resume for you and can talk through, hey, you said this word 20 times in the same sentence, or anything like that. So we would be happy to do that. So please give your local Career Force office a call.